And we're back, and it's time to break down the upcoming UFC 259. Three title fights in an absolutely outrageous card. And Max is here to break it all down for us. Max, what can we look forward to for this weekend?
And for once, I don't remember when the last time, but you can look forward to the entire main card. It's just going to be salivating for 10 p.m. to start, and it's not going to be one of those where you like set your drink making time or like something to do in between some of the like between the opener and the title fight. Five really competitive, relevant, important, tense matchups on the main card. As of right now, there's a full 15 fights on the card, with three of those fights being 25-minute title fights. So you can also just, if you're planning on sitting down for the early prelims, expect to be in your chair for a long time. I almost feel like the UFC set up this card expecting a couple of the fights to fall off and to have to do some shuffling. And typically in this last 30-hour crunch, we will see at least one or two fall off. But as of the last time I checked this morning, all 15 fights still seem to be scheduled. So might be a packed prelims. But with such a packed card and so much to talk about on the main card, I can really only do that. So we're gonna talk about the five fights on the main card, starting off with the main event, the super fight. Israel Adesanya, the undefeated UFC middleweight champion, takes on Jan Blachowicz, the newly crowned light heavyweight champion of the UFC division, who has done so, winning three of his last four fights by knockout, culminating in that beautiful performance against the fairly heavy favorite Dominic Reyes. And this is a super fight. It's Israel Adesanya, a guy who's done everything he's promised so far at the middleweight division. He came and he said, I'm the new dog. I'm pissing all over the division." And he did just that. In a little over a year, he became the interim champion. I had a lot of doubts about him against Whitaker, and he put all those away easily. And then he just had won probably his signature career performance against Paulo Costa, a fight that everyone thought would be competitive and interesting, and it was certainly not competitive, although it was very interesting. And he's going to be looking to bring those same tools that he's put on display in so many virtuoso performances against a bigger, stronger, more powerful, more dangerous man in Jan Blachowicz. And that's really what this fight is about. Can Izzy continue to perform the magic he performed at middleweight at a higher weight class? That's really what a super fight is. And that magic is going to be his speed, his footwork, his striking IQ. And it's going to be against a guy who has more power than the guys he's faced, and better grappling for sure, a more filled out frame. Just the threats are there. There's a reason fighters cut weight and get to the lowest division they can. It's because when you have the weight advantage, it stacks the fight in your favor in so many ways. And I remember Izzy's first fight, he weighed in at like 182 pounds, I think, and wondering if middleweight was for him, but he's come in more at weight. He hasn't bulked up for this fight though, so he's sticking with what got him to the dance party, and gonna see how that speed matches up against Blachowicz. It's I don't know who the onus is gonna be on, whether it's gonna be, is Izzy gonna lead? Is he gonna try and wait for Jan to swing it at him, make him miss, and then make him pay? Fingers very much crossed we don't get anything close to that Romero Adesanya fight that had like a combined 15 strikes thrown over 25 minutes. Watching Jan's fights, I mean, it's crazy because I when I got into UFC and watched Jan Blachowicz, I thought of this guy first and foremost as a grappler, and the world's kind of fallen in love with his power recently because he's had those three knockouts in his last four wins over Luke Rockhold, Corey Anderson, and Dominic Reyes. But I think the grappling is by far going to be his biggest advantage. And what you say that in a lot of Adesanya's fights. But what makes this one interesting more so than the others is going to be the frame difference. I mean, with Adesanya not bulking up and Jan, a thick, big middleweight who's going to have slightly less height and reach than Izzy, but still going to be a much narrower gap than Adesanya is used to. When Jan gets his hands around Izzy, is the mixture of technique and athleticism that he's put on display so far to really avoid almost any and all grappling situations still going to be enough? Or is the power of Blachowicz just going to nullify what Izzy has been able to do so far? If what kind of pace is Jan going to set? Because in the Dominic Reyes fight, he looked very composed, very patient. He knew one or two of his strikes would swing the fight in his favor, and that's what he did, just one at a time, hurting Dominic, making him more reticent, more hesitant, accumulating damage to the body, damage to the legs, damage to the nose. And Reyes just looked fearful in the last couple exchanges, and it eventually led to Jan finding the one shot to put it away. That slow counter strike weight style, though, is going to really get him into trouble if he doesn't have an answer for Izzy's leg kicks, though. I mean, that's essentially what worries me for Jan is the style he came out with is kind of similar to what Paulo Costa came out with against Adesanya. Just stay centered, stay composed, slowly move forward, and Izzy was just able to circle and feint and kick him all day. And we've seen so many times, like 5 or 6 hard kicks to the calf, and the fight's basically over. There's not much the opponent can do. Of course, the grappling will be an equalizer. It doesn't get much more dramatic than the Rory McDonald performance against Douglas Lima, where Lima compromised McDonald's leg to the point that he couldn't walk, and Rory just shot out in the last round and jumped on the takedown and won the fight like that. So Jan will have that option if there's leg damage to just take the fight to a place where the leg isn't a big deal, and that's going to be something McGregor, Costa, Rivera didn't really have. 3 guys in recent memory who've been pretty badly affected by those kicks. And that's sort of how Khabib neutralized them against Gaethje. Just you time one kick and get the takedown. So the question for me then from Jan is going to be, has he fallen in love too much with his power? You often hear him talking about Polish power, the legendary Polish power. Well, just don't take the fight where you have the biggest advantage, because if you try and no one's been able to win a striking match with Izzy in the UFC. Gastelum got close, but in the end, in that 5th round, he got utterly dominated. So if you try and match him strike for strike, gonna get into trouble. But it certainly helps to mix up the approach, and the body kick for Jan is what has me most interested and intrigued, because he had so much power in those kicks against Reyes. He landed 2, and there was this nasty welty bruise on Reyes's side. And Israel's like a skinny boy. We know this. You've heard a lot of people say it. So you've got to think, even one of those body kicks landing against Izzy could be huge in this fight. And that's the one thing Costa did land in his fight against Izzy. So I think part of Adesanya's phenomenal defense comes from being able to predict and neutralize what the opponent does. And that works really well when they're throwing hands at him. The more versatile the opponent is, the harder that's going to be, and the more it becomes a bread and butter back and forth MMA match. So fantastic main event. Does Adesanya continue the run into stardom, or can Jan Blachowicz successfully defend his 205-pound title and carve out a reign for himself? I'm so interested to find out, but I don't know when that question is going to start entering my mind on Saturday night because there's so many good fights on this card. The next title fight to talk about is Amanda Nunes versus Megan Anderson. Megan Anderson. You're making a face there.
I'm just looking at the odds for this fight, and Nunes is like a minus 1,200 favorite, so it's not looking good for Anderson.
No, that does sound about right based on what we've seen from their careers so far. The biggest question of this fight is really just going to be, does Nunes want to strike with Anderson or does she just want to win? Because Megan Anderson, I'll talk a little bit more about what's intriguing about her, but the two fights she's had against her two highest level opponents, they've both just made it look easy against her with the grappling. And one of those opponents was Holly Holm, who has added some grappling to her game in recent years, and that was kind of the coming out party of that, but still a lifelong kickboxer and not crazy athlete. So to get dominated by Holly Holm in the grappling like that, and then Felicia Spencer submitted her in under a round, and you've got to think Amanda Nunes's grappling is at least on par, if not better, than Felicia Spencer's. So really, the biggest question is just going to be, how does Amanda Nunes want to approach this fight? Because if she wants to just take it straight to the mat, look for ground and pound, and hunt a submission, it's probably going to be that simple and that easy based on the defense we've seen from Anderson in the past. I mean, we saw Nunes kind of do exactly that in the Germaine de Randamine fight, where she came out looking to test de Randamine on the feet. She kind of blitzed her with her athleticism, got some good licks in, got it to the ground, had ferocious ground and pound, and de Randamine weathered it, stayed in there, and then really turned the tables on the striking and started getting the advantages. But then every time Amanda Nunes wanted to take it to the ground, she did, because she's just the most complete, most well-rounded, best fighter at her size and weight. The women's MMA GOAT, for sure. There's not even any doubt in that, and because no one comes close to that level of completeness. She looked like the best striker in women's for a while. de Randamine tested and challenged that, but ultimately it didn't matter because Nunes's grappling was still so high level. So will she be willing to test around with Anderson on the feet or go straight to the grappling is the interesting question, because no one's wanted to stay on the feet with Megan Anderson. You say that much for her. She landed 2 strikes on Holly Holm, and Holm was right at the grappling. Her most recent fight, she landed 1 or 2 strikes, and the opponent went right to the clinch work, and for good reason, because the next time it went on the feet, Anderson put her out with like a pretty sweetly placed straight shot. And I remember some of her Invicta fights, her opponents would have broken orbital bones after Anderson's TKO KO victory. This girl just has so much power in her hands, and that's mostly what makes this fight interesting. But what also I'm curious about is the mental fortitude of Anderson in this situation, because say what you want about her performances, but she's been staring at the peak of women's MMA for almost half her career, I'd say. She was supposed to fight Chris Cyborg, who was at the time the highest threat, the most dangerous woman in the sport. And she was supposed to fight her back in, I think, like the summer of 2017, maybe even 2016. And that fight didn't happen. But when she did get signed to the UFC, it was always one step away from Cyborg. And then Nunes came and showed an even higher level, but for Anderson, that was where her eyes were looking. So she's kind of been training for this moment for almost 5 years, I'd say, and I'm curious what that brings to the table. Like, is there a mental fortitude that is going to be shown, a calmness, a game plan, an ability to put everything together in the right moment. That if you had to kind of brew a scenario for that, this would be a plausible one. It's no secret that the hole in her game is her grappling. That's been apparent long before her time in the UFC, and it's been made more clear with her time in the UFC. She has an excellent head coach in James Krause, so you know they've been working on it. And so I'll go back to, does all that time staring at the top, waiting for this moment, lead to the right preparations and the ability to utilize those preparations when the spotlight is shining brightest? I was thinking Anderson kind of reminds me of that kid on your high school basketball or volleyball team who the coach saw walking in the hallway at like 6'4", skinny as a bone, and just yanked them onto the team with like no words from the player themselves. And then you just see them like at the volleyball net, jumping, tapping the net every time, at the basketball net, trying to get the rebound, but just going up too soft in the paint. You send them the ball for like a post up play and they just like do a soccer throw at the net. That's Anderson has so much athletic potential with her frame, and you see an awkwardness in her stand up, in her grappling, that shows she hasn't fully tapped into that potential. So is tomorrow night the moment she does step into it after, I I keep saying 5 years. Maybe it was 2017, but close enough. So, way longer than almost anyone in UFC history has been preparing for a title shot for. What does Megan Anderson do with this opportunity? The odds aren't close. They shouldn't be close, but I guess just as someone who's had their eye on Anderson for years, it's interesting and to see her get this opportunity, and there are some questions begged. First of the 3 title fights, though, we've got Petr Yan versus Aljamain Sterling, and I talked a little last podcast about why I'm so excited for this fight, and I'll go over it again. Both fighters had this very similar period in their career where they put together an impressive winning streak that put them at the top of the division, and they both felt like they deserved a shot at the title, and they both watched Henry Cejudo go get surgery, tweet a lot, and talk a lot of shit about super fights, and then eventually end up letting Jose Aldo and Dominic Cruz be the guys that were going to walk in and challenge him for the title, ignoring who they both felt were the rightful number 1 contenders. And they both built up a lot of solidarity in this period, built up a lot of respect for each other. You saw Aljo, while frustrated to not get the eventual title shot after Cejudo retired, was still very complimentary and congratulatory towards Yan. And Yan, in likewise, when he saw Aljo take on Corey Sandhagen and just blitz him out of there with that submission, very congratulatory. This has been the fight to make for a long time now. There was talk of doing it for the rightful number 1 contender spot to challenge Cejudo, but I think it's so much better as a title fight, as an opportunity to take the throne as the king of the bantamweight division, which has so much talent blossoming, and try and put together one of those legendary reigns. Yan looking to take, I guess, his second step in that direction. Aljo looking to do it first, but this is really going to be a deciding Rubicon moment, I think, for hope for the bantamweight division, because these 2 guys have just been the guy for so long. And for Yan, his boxing has mostly brought him to the dance party, but it's been a complete put together training and skill set behind that boxing. The ability to kick when it's needed, the takedown defense, which has been phenomenal. The ground and pound he showed against Aldo was ferocious and kind of swung the fight for him early and late. Just shown what championship level talent is in the bantamweight division. So dominant ever since he entered the UFC. Aljo, the Funk Master, little more versatile. It sounds like he really wants to lean on his wrestling for this fight. And why wouldn't you? Jan is so scary on the feet and fairly untested in the grappling. So that's kind of the big question. Can Aljo get him to the ground? The Funkmaster nickname works well for him just because he keeps it transitioning from one position to the next. It's not like one and done takedown shots to hold you against the cage and do nothing until you get shrugged off. You saw that in the Corey Sandhagen fight, just lightning quick against the cage and then instantly working, instantly moving. Try something, it doesn't work, and you're on to the third or fourth thing, and Sandhagen's tapping out to a rear naked choke from the left arm he didn't see coming before he knows it. So for sure the highest level of grappling test that Jan has had to face, but also the highest level of striking that Mariah or Aljo has had to face maybe since Marias, who sat him down and knocked him out stone cold with that knee however many years back. Jan really likes to wait and make his reads, not attack first, but let them have the opportunity, the onus to move against him with just this little space in front of him sealed with how powerful and accurate his hands are. So the instant shoot takedown has gotten Sterling into trouble once in his career. Has he adjusted that? I mean, he's shown great striking at times against Rivera, against Munoz. So can he blend that striking at someone against someone who's has it at the highest level enough to set up that takedown? When he gets in, can he really put Jan down and keep him down in a way no one's been able to do? Does the submission and ground and pound threat open up if once Jan is kept down? Or does Jan make all the right reads, just neutralize the grappling attempts and slowly accumulate damage and make Sterling pay enough to put him away and hurt him the way he's done to literally everyone he's faced so far? I'm definitely more excited than the Nunes Anderson fight for this one. The fact that it is within the division and their streaking and momentum is in the same place, and there can only be one number one bantamweight, lends itself to a different kind of hype than the super fight. I might even be more interested in it than the other, just because, like I said, there can only be one in the division, and these are the rightful number one and number two fighters in this moment. So getting to see the two best in the world in a division square off is what you want from a title fight, and that's what we're getting. Striker versus grappler matchup. Aljo been hurt, tested at least once in recent-ish memory in the striking. Jan never really tested, challenged in the grappling. Which is going to fall? Cannot wait. That's the 3 title fights we've got, but there's also 2 other fights on this main card to go over quickly. The first one, Drew Dober versus Islam Makachev. Islam being the guy that everyone who's in Khabib's circles say this is going to be the next lightweight champion of the world. Not the next Khabib, because he's such a unique guy, but the Sambo credentials are there. The wrestling is deadly. The striking is probably more deadly. And the discipline, the work, you just see so many parallels. And it's made this guy such an interesting fighter for such a long time. And kind of similar to Khabib, the knock spin activity. Can you put together enough consistent fights and stop having to pull out long enough to get a UFC title shot? Because the lightweight division is so interesting and so loaded that it's not going to wait for you. So Drew Dober, not the name he was hoping to have when he was scheduled to fight Rafael dos Anjos earlier. Nonetheless, I think when a guy like Khabib is vouching for you so much, I think he's come to Vegas specifically to watch this fight. It does bolster your stock. And this guy is absolutely on the UFC radar. And with the way they're trying to move the lightweight title picture, you've got to think they'll want to slot Makachev in there if he gives them half a justification. It would also be really interesting to see him fight Connor someday down the line. So a lot of potential hype can be generated from this fight just based off what Makachev is built up to be, and what's behind him. And he's facing a great opponent to build that hype some more on, in Drew Dober, a guy who's just been on the tear in the lightweight division with his knockout power. Coming from a wrestling background makes it a little more interesting too, because he's not going to be helpless, or on paper he shouldn't be helpless against Makachev, which makes it so much more impressive if he is. But Makachev, unsimilar to Khabib in one other way, that he does have a loss on his record, knockout loss to Leonard dos Santos, one of the biggest what ifs in the men's lightweight division, I think. And I talk about adversity a lot. That's going to be interesting to monitor the career of Makachev, having that one knockout loss, how that affects and changes the way he implements his game plan in the cage, because he knows what happens if he gets careless for a second against a solid striker, if he makes a mistake. And Drew Dober is a guy where he has that power to make that same thing happen again if Makachev does anything wrong. So a guy who's could very well be the next champion of the men's lightweight division, against a serious knockout threat who's been taking care of fairly high-level guys recently. All the hype and momentum on the table for grabs, with the winner kind of one step out of the lightweight title picture, probably. I can read the Khabib post now saying give this guy a title shot if Makachev wins, which I don't think would be deserved, because there's just guys who have been beating higher level guys more frequently. But he certainly should be close if he wins. And of course, if Dober wins, then all that hype is his. And the same case, he's right there. So I mean, with Makachev's luck, maybe this is the fight that falls off the card, although I feel like that whole camp should be immune to COVID by now. Fingers crossed for it. Should be really interesting. Then the last fight I have my eye on is the main card opener, Alexander Rakic versus Thiago Santos, a matchup between two highly ranked light heavyweight fighters with title implications for sure. In Thiago Santos, you have a guy who was one judge's one round away from ending the reign of Jon Jones. He had that injury in that fight, and with the knockout he had before the Jon Jones fight of the current champion Blachowicz, it was really interesting to see his return to the octagon, and then he gets submitted by Glover, who then becomes the number one contender. But for the most part, Santos has looked so good at light heavyweight, moving up from middleweight. He's just had so much power, and he's had the technique and the patience to find it in almost all his fights. And he's facing a similarly threatening guy in Alexander Rakic, who is one of three light heavyweights I really have my eye on as the potential next title contender, the other two being Yuri Prochazka and Magomed Ankalaev. Rakic has shown some ferocious striking as of late, but he also showed great grappling against Anthony Smith, who is a black belt that has kind of been able to win the fights there when they're not going his way on the feet. So I thought it was really impressive that Rakic first took him out on the feet with vicious leg kicks and then out-grappled him, because Alexander Gustafsson, Volkan Oezdemir, two guys that come to mind who were doing fairly well against Smith on the feet, but then really got into trouble on the ground. So This fight kind of, you have hopes for it to go similarly to Thiago Santos versus Jimmy Manoa, when the two just came out swinging and like rocked and hurt each other in just this like 6 minute barn burner that ultimately ended with Santos's victory. Both Santos can be a bit of a wild man at times, and when you've got power and this terrifying, monstrous Brazilian is just trying to hurt you with everything he's got, the fight instinct and the fight or flight comes to mind, and you can see guys just swing back. So I think the matchmaker is hoping for something similar to what I just described to get this card started, and I see it as very plausible. Anyone's fight, both guys have so much power. It'll be interesting to see if the approach I just described is wrong, and if either is a little more technical, a little more cautious, or if they just throw that into the wind and trust their hands and reflexes. Either way, huge title implications. Look for the winner of this fight when discussing setting up who gets the next light heavyweight shot after Glover. Lots of interesting fights on the prelims too. 10 of them is going to make for a very long night. The Cruz versus Kenny prelim headliner is certainly interesting. We'll see how they go, what gets canceled, if anything on the main card does, and if they have to move up fights. But overall, this is for sure a really stacked UFC card, and I'm excited for Super Fight Weekend.